When I saw the fence lying in splinters across my flower bed, I felt a tight knot of disbelief settle in my chest. Someone had crossed a line I didn't even know could be crossed, right in my own backyard. I remember that morning with sharp clarity. The sun was just beginning to stretch its pale fingers across the dewy grass, and the aroma of wet earth mixed with the faint scent of roses from my garden. I had stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, expecting the usual serenity of my Saturday mornings. Instead, the sight that met me made my heart race. The wooden fence that had separated my yard from the neighbors had been smashed down. Wood splinters jutted out at odd angles, and a gaping hole yawned where privacy once existed. And worse than the fence itself were the muddy paw prints crisscrossing my tulips. It didn't take long for the first dog to appear. A golden retriever, panting and wagging its tail, trotted into my yard like it owned the place. Then another, a beagle with ears flopping over, joined in. And soon more appeared, as if the fence had been an invitation written in invisible ink. Each bark, each sniff, each pawing of my carefully planted flower beds was a small betrayal. At first, I thought maybe it was a one-time thing. Perhaps my neighbor's dog had slipped out, or maybe someone had been careless. But as I bent down to scoop up a stray tulip, I noticed something familiar. A scratch on the corner post that looked like it had been pried open with tools, not chewed away by an anxious dog. My stomach sank. This wasn't an accident. Before the fence, my mornings were quiet. I lived alone in my little house on Maplewood Lane, a tidy home with ivy crawling up the front porch and wind chimes that tinkled softly whenever a breeze passed through. My neighbors were polite but distant, and I liked it that way. My life revolved around routines I cherished: watering the garden, listening to jazz records, baking bread, and reading in the afternoons while sunlight spilled across my living room floor. I had grown fond of the subtle rhythms of my life, the ordinary kindnesses that made it feel like home. Mrs. Henderson next door waved from her porch every morning, her cat perched on her shoulder like a tiny regal sentinel. Mr. Patel across the street mowed his lawn at exactly 9 a.m., humming Bollywood tunes, while his children darted around him laughing. And then there was my neighbor on the other side, Tom, a man who kept to himself mostly, with a small, chaotic yard full of shrubs and plastic toys. We'd exchanged nods and polite smiles over the years, but never much more. So when I saw my flowers trampled and the fence broken, the shock was compounded by a strange sense of violation. I felt as though the invisible boundary of my life had been breached, not just the physical one. It wasn't just wood and nails that had been destroyed. It was a promise of peace I had cultivated every morning for years. After I shooed the first few dogs away, I tried calling Tom. No answer. Then I knocked on his door, but there was no reply. It was as if the quiet suburb had decided to swallow him whole, leaving me with splintered wood and muddy chaos. I remember standing there in my bare slippers, the damp earth seeping between my toes, staring at the garden I had spent hours tending. Each flower bent awkwardly under tiny paws, each petal smudged with soil, and somewhere deep inside, a spark of anger flickered. It's strange, the way anger sneaks in quietly before it becomes something you can't ignore. I could feel it curling up my spine, pressing my shoulders backward, whispering that something had to be done. But at the same time, a part of me, a calmer, softer part, hesitated. Tom had been my neighbor for years. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe the dogs had gotten out, and he was on his way to fix it. I tried to convince myself of that as I swept up the broken pieces of wood, tossing them into a cardboard box in the garage. But each splinter reminded me of how carefully I had planted that garden, how meticulously I had arranged my roses, daffodils, and tulips. I ran my fingers over the broken post, and felt the rough edges bite into my palms. The anger returned, sharper this time. By the time I went back inside, coffee gone cold, I could still hear the faint barking in the distance, dogs not mine, wandering freely in a place they had no business being. It was the kind of small chaos that gnawed at the edges of your patience, until the calm world you had built started to feel fragile. And in that moment, fragile felt dangerous. I made a mental note. I would get to the bottom of this. But for now, I closed the blinds, hoping the sight of the yard would fade from my mind long enough to think. I didn't yet know that this was only the beginning. that the small intrusion of dogs would evolve into something much bigger, that it would pull me into a drama I had never expected, testing patience I thought I had, and revealing sides of people I didn't know existed, even myself. The garden smelled of mud and roses that day, a strange mixture of sweetness and decay. And as I stood there, sipping the last of my coffee, I realized that my sanctuary, my little world of calm, was no longer my own. I didn't know it yet, but soon, the boundary of my yard would become the boundary of my life. And someone or something was determined to cross it. After weeks of confrontation, mediation, and countless afternoons spent repairing my yard, life slowly began to settle. The fence was finally rebuilt, not just a barrier of wood, but a symbol of boundaries that were respected. Finally, in more ways than one, Tom had been fined by the homeowners association, and the dogs were mostly kept within his property after repeated warnings. The public pressure had worked. It wasn't vindictive, just accountability. But more than the fence or the yard, it was my own peace I had been fighting for. I remember standing outside one late afternoon, watching the sun dip behind the maples that lined the street, the freshly planted tulips swaying in the soft breeze. I inhaled deeply. The air smelled faintly of soil and late-blooming roses, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since the first paw prints. Calm. The anger, the frustration, the sense of violation. It hadn't disappeared completely, and I didn't try to force it away. Instead, I let it settle like sediment in a jar, knowing that over time, the water would clear. There was a lesson in this, a quiet understanding. Boundaries are not just physical lines, but the respect we expect from others and the courage we need to assert ourselves when they are crossed. Tom and I never became friends, and we didn't need to. But we reached a sort of truce, a recognition that mutual respect was not optional. I forgave him in my own way, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to release the hold that anger had on my life. Forgiveness, I realized, was more for me than anyone else. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the routines that had brought me joy before this chaos began. I spent mornings tending the garden, mornings of peace punctuated by birdsong and the distant hum of the neighborhood. I baked bread again, letting the smell of warm dough fill the kitchen. And I read in the afternoons while sunlight spilled across the living room floor, just as I had before. But something had shifted. I was more vigilant now, yes, but also more appreciative of the small things. The quiet sway of a tree branch, the way tulips bent gently in the breeze, the deep satisfaction of a life. When life gets messy, unpredictable, or unfair, boundaries are love too. The love we give ourselves by insisting on respect, and the love we extend to others by holding it clearly. Would you have done what I did? Would you have stood your ground, or walked away silently? Sometimes the smallest choices, how we react, how we rebuild, how we forgive, define us more than the grandest victories ever could. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe and share your thoughts. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to defend your personal space, your peace, or your home? How did it change you? I'd love to hear your stories because sometimes sharing is the first step to healing, understanding, and finding strength in the quiet moments we never expected to matter.